11 years. That's how long a 3-acre pond on the back 40 of a Holt County farm sat green, reeking, and written off as dead water by everyone who drove past it, including the woman who owned it. By the summer of 1987, cars were pulling off the county road just to look at it, not to hold their noses and shake their heads the way people had for over a decade, but to stand at the fence line with notepads and cameras, because the same pond that had once been the ugliest corner of Voss Farm had quietly become the most talked about 3 acres in the entire valley. Della Voss had inherited that pond, along with the rest of her father's 60 acres, in the spring of 1979, and for most of the 8 years that followed, almost nobody in Holt County, including her own brother, believed she had inherited anything worth keeping where that water was concerned. The pond sat low at the back of the property, fed by an old spring and choked, for as long as anyone could remember, by a thick green algae bloom that thickened every summer until the water beneath it went a flat, lightless black. Extension agents who'd come out over the years to look at it had used words like eutrophic and oxygen depleted and, more than once, simply dead, and the man who ran the largest dairy operation in the valley, the same man who chaired the county's Soil and Water Conservation Board and controlled more acreage and more water rights than anyone else in Holt County, had told Della to her face, more than once, that the kindest thing she could do for that pond was fill it in and farm the ground underneath it instead. By August of 1987, that same man was sitting in a packed county hearing room watching a state biologist hold up a water quality report with his own signature on it, a report he had filed himself 9 years earlier as a formal complaint, now being read back to the room as the single piece of evidence that destroyed his case. The hearing room that morning was not built to hold the crowd that showed up for it. Folding chairs lined 3 walls, and more than one person who came expecting a routine drainage matter found themselves standing in the doorway by the time the session got underway, drawn less by county business in general than by the particular spectacle of watching a man as locally powerful as Cyrus Dunmore explain himself in front of neighbors who had spent a decade agreeing with whatever he said about water rights without much question. Nobody in that room that morning, including most of the people who had once driven past the Voss place holding their noses, could have told you with any confidence what nutrient loading actually meant for a pond's biology, or why the very thing that had made the water look sick for over a decade was about to be presented as the reason it had become the most valuable 3 acres in the county. They would learn all of it before the session adjourned. But none of that had happened yet on the gray spring morning in 1979 when Della Voss first stood at the edge of that pond as its sole owner, looking at 3 acres of standing green water that her father had spent the last years of his life apologizing for, and the rest of the county had spent twice that long laughing about. To understand how a stagnant farm pond became the reason people drove out from 3 counties over just to stand at a fence and look at it, you have to start with the water itself, and with the man who had spent years quietly making sure it stayed exactly the kind of dead water everybody assumed it was. Holt County had never been a place where a young woman running a farm alone got the benefit of the doubt easily, and the story of that pond, more than anything else that happened on Voss land in those years, became the thing neighbors still brought up at the feed co-op counter long after the details of who said what to whom had started to blur. Some remembered it as a story about water. Others remembered it as a story about a man who'd spent 30 years assuming nobody would ever read his own paperwork back to him in a room full of people who mattered. Either way, by the time the story had settled into the kind of thing people told newcomers to the valley over coffee, it had become less a piece of local gossip than something closer to a cautionary tale, the kind every county seems to need at least one of, about the cost of deciding too early and too confidently what a thing is worth. Marrow Valley ran shallow and wide through the center of Holt County, good bottomland on either side of the creek that had supported dairy and row crop farming since before anyone living could remember a time it hadn't. Cyrus Dunmore's family had been running cattle in that valley for 3 generations, and by the time Cyrus took the operation over from his father in the early 1960s, Dunmore Dairy had grown into the largest single operation in the county, just under 900 head on land that stretched along nearly 2 miles of the valley's best ground. Cyrus did not just run the biggest herd in Holt County. He chaired the County Soil and Water Conservation Board, the body that approved drainage permits, irrigation allotments, and runoff management plans for nearly every farm in the valley, and he owned the only feed and grain co-op within 30 miles, which meant that almost every farmer in the county, sooner or later, did business with him on terms he had a hand in setting. People in Holt County had a particular way of describing Cyrus Dunmore that sounded almost admiring until you sat with it a minute. Nothing moved through that valley, water or otherwise, without Cyrus knowing about it first. Farmers who crossed him on a permit or a grazing boundary tended to find their feed prices at the co-op had drifted a little higher the following season, never enough to point to directly as retaliation, just enough that most people in the valley had learned, over the years, that it was easier to stay on Cyrus's good side than to test how far his patience actually extended. Roy Voss, Della's father, had farmed 60 acres directly downhill from the lower edge of Dunmore land for almost 40 years, a modest dairy and hay operation that had never come close to threatening anyone, least of all Cyrus Dunmore. The Voss Pond sat at the lowest point of that 60 acres, fed by a natural spring but also, less naturally, by a drainage ditch Dunmore had cut decades earlier to carry runoff and manure wash from his own feedlots downhill and off his property as efficiently as possible, a ditch that emptied directly into the upper end of the Voss Pond and had been doing so for as long as Della could remember. Roy complained about it for years, mildly and without much hope of changing anything, since the man controlling the conservation board that would have to approve any change to that drainage pattern was the same man whose runoff was causing the problem in the first place. By the time Della came home in 1976, 28 years old and recently divorced, to help her aging father manage the place, the pond had already gone the color of strong tea most summers, its surface thick with algae from one bank to the other, and Roy had more or less stopped fighting it, the way a man stops fighting something he's decided he doesn't have the standing to win. Della had spent 6 years away from Holt County before that, married to a man 2 states over who'd never had much patience for the long hours farm life demanded of a spouse, and coming home at 28 to help her father felt, to most of the relatives who commented on it, less like a homecoming than an admission that things hadn't worked out the way she'd planned. She didn't argue with that read of it. She put her head down, learned the dairy operation alongside her father the way she'd once half-resented being kept away from it as a teenager, and tried not to think too hard about what people in town were saying about a divorced woman in her late 20s moving back in with her father instead of starting something of her own somewhere else. Della worked that farm alongside her father for 3 years before he died of a stroke in the spring of 1979, doing every job the operation needed and several nobody had ever formally asked her to take on. And when he passed, she did not sell, even though more than one relative quietly suggested it might be the sensible thing to do for a woman running 60 acres alone. She kept the cattle, kept the hay ground, and kept her father's one remaining hired hand, Otis Greer, a man in his late 50s who had worked Voss land since before Della was born and had no particular interest in retiring just because the man who'd hired him was gone. For the first few years after Roy's death, the farm held its own well enough, except for the pond, which kept doing exactly what it had been doing for over a decade, turning a thick, sour green every summer, smelling bad enough by August that Della stopped taking the shortcut path past it on hot afternoons, and serving, as far as anyone in the county could tell, no purpose whatsoever beyond being something Cyrus Dunmore's runoff ditch emptied into on its way off his land and out of his way. The push to finally do something about the pond came, in the end, not from Della, but from Cyrus Dunmore himself, in the spring of 1981, when he drove down to the Voss place uninvited on a Saturday morning with a folded survey map under his arm. He had, he explained, standing at the edge of the water with his boots well clear of the mud, been thinking about expanding his own runoff retention system, and the lowest corner of Voss land, including the pond itself, would fit conveniently into that plan if Della were willing to sell him the back 6 acres outright. "That water's not doing you a bit of good the way it sits," he said, not unkindly, in the tone of a man offering a favor rather than making a calculation. "Dead water like that. All it's good for is breeding mosquitoes and making the rest of the place smell bad come July. I'd be taking a liability off your hands and paying you for the privilege." He named a price that was, by any honest measure of bottomland in that valley, low enough that Della did the math standing right there at the fence and said as much, quietly, the way she said most things. Cyrus spread his hands the way a man does when he believes he's already been generous. Most people wouldn't offer you anything at all for ground that can't grow a thing and smells like it's rotting half the year, he said. I'm doing you a kindness, Della. Whether you can see it that way yet or not, she told him she'd think about it, which was not quite a no, and Cyrus drove off apparently satisfied that the matter was more or less settled, the way men in his position generally were satisfied about matters they assumed had already been decided in their favor. He'd added, almost as he was climbing back into his truck, that he'd known her father a long time and didn't like to see his daughter struggling to hold on to ground that was costing her more in aggravation than it was worth, the kind of comment that managed to sound like sympathy and condescension in the same breath, and one Della turned over more than once in the weeks that followed. Otis, watching the whole exchange from the barn doorway, didn't bother hiding his opinion once Cyrus's truck was out of sight. Man's been dumping his runoff in your water for 30 years, and now he wants to buy the evidence, he said. Doesn't seem to me there's anything generous about that. Della didn't disagree. But she also didn't have an obvious better use for 6 acres of dead pond bottom, and the price Cyrus had offered, low as it was, would have covered a year's worth of feed and equipment repairs the operation genuinely needed. She told Otis she'd think about that too, and meant it, and for the better part of a year, she genuinely considered selling, mostly because nobody, including her, had ever given her a reason to think there was anything to that water worth holding on to beyond stubbornness. The bank account told one story that winter, thin enough in February that she put off replacing a failing water heater for 6 weeks longer than she should have, and the pond, sitting there doing nothing visible for anyone, told what felt at the time like a much simpler story about money she could have in hand instead of mud she couldn't. What changed her mind, in the end, wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a slow accumulation of small observations she'd made without quite noticing she was making them, the kind of thing a person only recognizes as a pattern once enough of it has piled up. She found herself, more than once that winter, walking out to the pond after evening chores for no particular reason she could name, standing at the bank in the cold, just looking at the water the way she hadn't bothered to look at it in years, and each time she came back to the house a little less certain that selling it off cheap was the obviously sensible choice everyone in her family kept telling her it was. She couldn't have explained to anyone, that winter, exactly what she thought she was looking for out there in the dark, only that something about the water kept pulling her back, the same low hum of curiosity her father had apparently let himself stop listening to somewhere along the way. Otis noticed those evening walks too, though he never said much about them beyond the occasional comment about her catching her death of cold standing out there in February. And looking back later, he'd admit he'd quietly started to suspect, well before Della said a word about it to anyone, that she hadn't actually made up her mind to sell it all. Otis was the one who finally put a name to what neither of them had been saying out loud. Sitting on the tailgate of the truck one evening in late summer of 1982 after a long day of haying, looking out at the pond the way he'd looked out at it 1,000 times before without really seeing it. You ever notice the bullfrogs out there are bigger than any place else I've worked, he said, mostly to himself. And there's more of them. Whole lot more, for water everybody says is dead. Della had noticed something similar without ever putting words to it. The way the cattails at the pond's edge grew taller and thicker than anywhere else on the property. The way the herons that worked the shallow in some mornings seemed to linger there longer than they lingered at any other water she'd ever watched them work. She mentioned it once to her sister-in-law at a family dinner that fall, almost as a joke, and got back exactly the reaction she expected, a raised eyebrow and a comment about how a person could find a silver lining in just about anything if they looked hard enough, followed by a gentler but no less pointed suggestion that maybe it was time to take Cyrus Dunmore's offer and stop pouring good money into bad ground. Her sister-in-law meant well by it. Della understood that even at the time, the same way most of the family's advice that year was offered out of genuine concern rather than any real desire to see her fail, which somehow made it harder to ignore than if it had simply been cruel. Della's own mother, visiting from 2 counties over that Thanksgiving, walked down to look at the pond herself, wrinkled her nose at the smell drifting up even in November, and told her daughter plainly that she didn't understand why anyone would fight to keep something the whole county had already decided was worthless, especially when keeping it meant turning down real money from a man who controlled half the business in the valley. Della didn't have a good answer for her mother that day, not one she could put into words that didn't sound like simple stubbornness dressed up as principle. Her brother, who farmed 2 counties away and had never had much patience for what he called Della's tendency to make things harder than they needed to be, told her over the phone that winter that he'd take Cyrus's offer himself if it were his land, and that the two of them had grown up watching their father lose the same argument with that water for 30 years without ever once winning it. She kept the land anyway, declined to give Cyrus a final answer either way through the rest of that year, and spent the following spring doing something nobody in her family considered especially promising. She started keeping a small notebook, the kind sold at the feed store for recording calving dates, and began writing down, every week or two, what she actually observed at the pond instead of what everyone had always told her was true about it. She felt faintly foolish the first few times she did it, crouched at the bank with a pencil and a notebook meant for livestock records, and told herself more than once that she'd stop if it started to feel like a waste of time. It never quite did. The water clarity at different depths. Which weeks the algae thickened and which weeks it thinned. How many frog calls she counted at dusk compared to the stock pond on the neighboring Ferris place, a clean, well-managed pond everyone agreed was healthy. By the time she'd filled half that notebook, sometime in the spring of 1983, the picture forming in those pages didn't match the word dead in any way she could square with what she was actually seeing written down in her own hand, week after week, in numbers nobody else in the county had ever bothered to collect. She started bringing the notebook with her on the rare occasions she ran into Cyrus at the co-op, not to show him, but because carrying it had become a kind of quiet insurance against believing, on the days her own resolve wavered, that everyone around her might simply be right, and she might simply be wasting her time on water that genuinely was as worthless as they all kept insisting it was. She never once showed him a page of it during those encounters, content for the time being to simply have it close at hand, a small private rebuttal to a conversation nobody was actually having out loud yet. Looking back on it years later, she'd say that notebook was the one decision in those early years she never once second-guessed. Even on the nights everything else about keeping the pond felt like a mistake, she couldn't quite admit to anyone. It was Otis, in the end, who suggested she show the notebook to somebody who'd actually know what to make of it. And in the early summer of 1983, Della drove 2 hours to the State University's Extension office and asked, somewhat sheepishly, whether anyone there worked with ponds instead of just crop fields. She was put in touch with Dr. Sylvia Kestrel, an aquatic ecologist running a small wetland research program who'd spent most of her career studying exactly the kind of nutrient-heavy, algae-choked water bodies that farmers across 3 states had been filling in or draining for decades on the assumption that green water was automatically dead water. Kestrel drove out to Voss Farm herself 2 weeks later, walked the bank of the pond for the better part of an afternoon, took water samples at 6 different points and depths, and read through Della's notebook twice before she said much of anything at all. Everybody who's looked at this pond has been measuring the wrong thing, she said finally, sitting on the same tailgate Otis had sat on the year before. Algae bloom this thick usually does mean trouble, but it means the water's choking on too much of something, not that it's empty of life. Your water's carrying an enormous nutrient load, nitrogen and phosphorus mostly, almost certainly from decades of runoff washing in from upslope. And most of that nutrient load is exactly the kind of thing that, managed properly instead of left to bloom unchecked, supports an extraordinary amount of biomass. She held up one of the water samples to the light. This isn't dead water, Della. This is some of the richest water I've tested in 3 years of doing this job. It's just been left completely unmanaged for so long that the only thing visibly thriving is the one species, the algae, that can handle the imbalance without any help. She flipped through several more pages of the notebook before she looked up again. Honestly, the fact that you kept this kind of record without any training in it is more useful to me than half the formal water studies I've reviewed this year. Most landowners just complain about the smell and want it gone. You actually watched it. Kestrel set the notebook down carefully, almost reverently, the way a person handles something they recognize as more valuable than its owner currently understands. Della asked her, carefully, what that actually meant in practical terms for a 60-acre dairy farm and not a research program. Kestrel set her clipboard down on the tailgate and took a moment before answering, the way a person does when they want to be sure the next thing they say lands the way they intend it to. Kestrel told her plainly, properly aerated and managed, With the right combination of bottom-feeding and filter-feeding species introduced in the right ratios, that nutrient load could support commercial densities of crayfish and a fast-growing aquatic crop like watercress at yields most pond owners in the region could never come close to matching. Because most pond owners in the region were working with water that didn't have anywhere near this much free, naturally occurring fertility sitting in it already. People have been telling you for years this water is worthless because it's too rich, Kestrel said. That's almost exactly backwards. The thing that's been killing it is also the thing that could make it the most productive 3 acres on this entire farm. If somebody finally managed it instead of just complaining about it or trying to make it go away, Della sat with that for a long moment. Looking out at water, she had spent 4 years half convinced she should sell off cheap to the very man whose runoff had made it what it was. The thing the whole county had agreed for a decade was dead, it turned out, had never actually been dead at all. It had just never once been asked the right question by anyone who knew enough to ask it. She thought, sitting there, about every extension agent who'd walked that bank over the years, clipboard in hand, writing down the same word her father had eventually learned to repeat back to anyone who asked, and how none of them, not one, had ever once brought a water sample back to a lab instead of simply trusting their own nose and their own assumptions about what green water was supposed to mean. Before she left that afternoon, Kestrel offered to write up a short formal summary of her findings, the kind of one-page document that would carry weight with a lender or a buyer far more than a handwritten notebook ever could on its own. And Della accepted without quite understanding yet how many times over the following years she'd end up pulling that single page out of a folder to settle an argument she hadn't expected to have. Della did not tell Cyrus Dunmore, or anyone connected to the conservation board he chaired, what Sylvia Kestrel had told her that summer, and she made a deliberate point over the following 2 years of keeping the pond looking, from the county road, exactly as unremarkable as it always had. She secured a modest equipment loan that fell through a small agricultural lender 2 towns over, an institution with no relationship whatsoever to Dunmore's feed co-op or his seat on the conservation board. Using Kestrel's water analysis and her own 3 years of notebook data as her case, instead of the kind of established farm credit history most lenders in the valley expected to see. The loan covered an aeration system sized for 3 acres, a modest stock of crayfish brought in from a hatchery 2 states south, and enough watercress starts to seed the shallow margins where Kestrel's plan called for them. All of it installed quietly that fall and winter by Della and Otis, working mostly after dark and on Sundays, when the county road past the farm carried almost no traffic at all to notice. Otis took to parking the work truck behind the equipment shed instead of in its usual spot by the barn during those months, a small precaution that struck Della as faintly ridiculous the first time he did it and increasingly sensible every time afterward, given how often Cyrus's own hands drove that stretch of road checking fence lines that happened to run within sight of the Voss gate. Kestrel came back twice more over the following year, officially as an informal favor and unofficially because she'd grown genuinely invested in watching her own theory prove out on real ground instead of a research plot, helping Della fine-tune stocking densities and aeration timing as the system found its balance. On one of those visits, she brought a graduate student along, a young man who spent most of the afternoon taking photographs of the watercress beds and asking Della more questions about the pond's history than she'd been asked by anyone in years. Questions that made her realize, somewhere in the middle of answering them, how rarely anyone had ever actually wanted to know the details instead of just the verdict. Otis, who had spent 2 years quietly doubting whether any of it would amount to more than an expensive experiment, stopped voicing those doubts sometime in the second spring, once the crayfish population had visibly exploded past anything either of them had expected, and the watercress along the margins had grown thick and dark green in a way that made the rest of the pond's water, by contrast, look noticeably clearer than it had in a decade. By the 3rd year, Della had quietly secured a standing buyer in Marguerite Boyle, a purveyor who supplied specialty seafood and produced to a small but growing list of restaurants 2 hours south, a connection Kestrel had helped arrange after mentioning, almost as an aside, that pond-raised crayfish and watercress from clean, well-managed water were increasingly hard for restaurant buyers in that region to source reliably. Boyle had grown up nowhere near a farm herself and approached the whole arrangement with the kind of careful skepticism Della had come to expect from almost everyone, asking pointed questions about water testing and harvest consistency before she'd commit to anything more than a small trial order. Boyle drove out to see the operation herself that spring, walked the bank twice, tasted both the crayfish and the watercress on the spot, and offered Della a standing seasonal contract on terms that made Otis go quiet in a different way than his earlier doubting silence had ever sounded. None of this changed how Voss Farm looked from the county road. Della kept driving the same truck, kept the front pasture looking exactly as modest as it always had, and let the county's general impression of her, the woman who'd inherited her father's place and was probably struggling to keep it going, continue unchallenged for as long as she could manage. Because a county that thought she was barely getting by was a county that had no particular reason to look closely at what was actually happening on the back 6 acres. By the close of her 4th full season managing the pond, what had once been 3 acres of stagnant green water producing nothing but mosquitoes and complaints had become, on paper, the single most profitable parcel of ground on the entire farm, out-earning the dairy operation per acre by a margin that would have seemed absurd to anyone in the county still picturing the same dead pond they'd been driving past and holding their noses at for over a decade. Della kept a separate ledger for the pond entirely apart from the rest of the farm's books, a habit she'd started almost by instinct and come to appreciate considerably more once she understood exactly how much that single sheet of numbers would eventually be worth in a room full of people who doubted her. It took Cyrus Dunmore nearly 2 years to notice anything had changed at the Voss place, mostly because for most of those 2 years there had been nothing visible from the road to suggest it. What finally caught his attention, in the early spring of 1986, was a refrigerated delivery van with out-of-county plates parked at the Voss gate 2 mornings a week, spotted by one of his own hands driving fence along the property line. Cyrus asked around the way he always asked around in a county where he sat on the conservation board and ran the only feed co-op, expecting to learn within a few days exactly what kind of trouble or opportunity he was looking at. He found very little. Della's equipment loan wasn't through any lender he had influence with, and nobody at the feed co-op could tell him she'd bought so much as a bag of standard feed in over a year, which struck him as strange for a 60-acre dairy operation he assumed was still running the same way it always had. For a man whose influence in Holt County rested largely on always knowing exactly what was happening on every acre of ground in it, not knowing was its own kind of insult, and Cyrus did not sit easily with insults he couldn't immediately answer. He mentioned the van to 2 other board members at a conservation meeting that spring, more out of irritation than any real plan, and one of them, only half joking, suggested he simply drive down and ask Della himself, instead of working himself up over a delivery truck. He drove down to the Voss place himself that summer, found the pond transformed into something he barely recognized, aerators humming quietly at the center, watercress thick and glossy along the margins, and Della standing at the bank in waders pulling a crayfish trap that came up heavier than anything he'd have guessed that water could produce. He stood at the fence for a long moment before he said anything at all, and when he finally spoke it was to ask, somewhat stiffly, whether she'd gotten the proper permits for whatever this was, a question that struck Della as almost funny given how many years he'd spent telling her the water wasn't worth permitting anything on at all. He didn't say much that visit beyond a few pointed questions about permits, and left without renewing his old offer to buy the back acreage, having apparently decided, for the moment, that a different approach made more sense. By that fall, with word of the operation's quality reaching restaurant buyers 2 counties beyond Boyle's usual territory, and a regional farm paper running a short item about an unusual small-scale aquaculture operation thriving in Holt County, Cyrus turned his attention to the one lever still entirely under his control, the County Soil and Water Conservation Board's authority to designate drainage easements across private land deemed necessary for managing runoff and flood risk in the broader watershed. The farm paper article, brief as it was, had apparently bothered him more than he let on to anyone, since 2 people who worked at the co-op later mentioned overhearing him ask, more than once that fall, whether anyone knew exactly how a pond nobody had taken seriously for a decade had ended up written about in a publication that covered 3 counties. He proposed, that winter, an expanded drainage easement running directly through the lower 6 acres of Voss land, including the pond itself, framed publicly as a necessary flood mitigation measure for the valley as a whole rather than anything aimed at one specific property. The proposal's language described the targeted water body as a degraded, low-value drainage feature contributing to downstream water quality problems, citing, among its supporting evidence, a formal water quality complaint Cyrus himself had filed with the county 9 years earlier, in 1978, documenting what he had described at the time as a severely impaired, nutrient-overloaded pond requiring remediation. He had filed that complaint, originally, as nothing more than routine paperwork covering himself in case anyone ever asked questions about where his own runoff ditch emptied, and had not thought about the document again in nearly a decade. What Cyrus did not anticipate, because it had genuinely never occurred to him, was that the very report he'd filed to protect himself from a question nobody had ever asked would end up sitting on a hearing room table 9 years later as the clearest evidence anyone had ever produced of exactly how much fertility that water had been carrying for exactly as long as his own ditch had been feeding it there. He had drafted the easement proposal himself over a series of evenings that winter, narrowing its language carefully enough that, by his own reading of the county's drainage statutes, it would apply cleanly to the Voss Pond and almost nowhere else in the watershed, confident, the way he had been confident about most things in Holt County for 30 years, that nobody on the board would look closely enough at the supporting paperwork to notice exactly what it actually proved. The county hearing room was already standing room only by the time Commissioner Ada Lindgren called the drainage easement session to order that August morning in 1987. Word of the proposal having spread through the valley fast enough that more than a few people showed up simply curious to see how a man as locally powerful as Cyrus Dunmore would handle a fight he clearly hadn't expected to need. Cyrus presented his case himself, citing his own 1978 complaint by date and file number, describing the targeted water body to the room as exactly what his original paperwork had called it: a severely impaired, nutrient-overloaded pond posing an ongoing water quality risk to the watershed, language that, to a room mostly unfamiliar with the difference between a problem and an opportunity sitting in the same chemistry, sounded like more than enough justification for the easement he was requesting. He spoke for nearly 15 minutes, citing drainage statutes by section number and reading portions of his own 1978 complaint aloud in the same flat, authoritative tone he used at every board meeting he'd ever chaired, the tone of a man who had never once had to seriously prepare for the possibility that someone in the room might actually contradict him. When Commissioner Lindgren asked whether Ms. Voss wished to respond, Della stood, and rather than disputing a word of what Cyrus had said about the water's nutrient load, she asked the board's permission to call Dr. Sylvia Kestrel, who had brought with her, at Della's request, a copy of Cyrus's own 1978 complaint alongside 4 years of her own water quality data from the same pond. Kestrel laid the two documents side by side on the table and walked the room through them methodically, pointing out that the nutrient readings in Cyrus's 9-year-old complaint and her own most recent samples were, chemically speaking, remarkably consistent. The same rich, nitrogen and phosphorus-heavy water Cyrus's own ditch had been feeding into that pond for decades. "The water hasn't changed," she told the room. "What changed is that somebody finally managed it instead of treating high fertility as a defect to be drained away." Mr. Dunmore's own complaint from 1978 is, ironically, some of the best documentation we have of exactly how much natural productive capacity this water has been carrying the entire time he's been calling it a liability. Marguerite Boyle spoke next, confirming a standing 3-year supply contract, climbing seasonal volumes, and a price per pound for both the crayfish and the watercress that drew an audible reaction from more than one farmer in the room who'd spent years assuming there was no real money in pond work. She added, almost as an afterthought, that she'd had to turn away 2 other restaurant accounts that season simply because Della's pond couldn't keep up with demand at the volume those buyers were asking for, a detail that landed in the room with considerably more weight than Boyle herself seemed to realize it would. Then Della spoke, briefly, laying her original notebook on the table beside Kestrel's data and Cyrus's old complaint, for years of weekly observations that had started the whole process long before anyone with a credential had ever looked at that water twice. There was nothing degraded or low value about a water body that Cyrus's own 9-year-old paperwork had documented as carrying exactly the nutrient richness that now supported the most profitable acreage on the Voss farm. Della closed her notebook gently and looked across the table at Cyrus for the first time since she'd stood up, not with any particular triumph in her expression, just the same steady patience she'd carried through every conversation she'd ever had with him about that water. The hearing room went quiet in a way it hadn't been all morning, and somewhere near the back, someone repeated, just loud enough to carry, the same word Cyrus had used about that pond for years, dead, and the laughter that followed it landed nowhere close to where it would have landed 2 years earlier. Commissioner Lindgren, with Cyrus's own decade-old complaint sitting on the table as the board's own central piece of evidence, had little real room left to rule any direction but one. She denied the easement proposal on the record, noted for the minutes that the water body in question appeared to represent a uniquely productive small-scale aquaculture resource rather than a drainage liability, and closed the session considerably faster than she had opened it. Cyrus sat through the rest of the morning's business without saying much of anything, his own folder of supporting paperwork still open on the table in front of him, and several people in the room would later say it was the first time in their memory they'd ever watched him leave a county meeting without the last word. Word of the hearing moved through Holt County faster than the formal denial paperwork ever could, and within a season 2 separate landowners with stagnant, algae-choked ponds of their own that had sat and used for years called Della directly, asking whether she'd be willing to walk their water and tell them honestly whether it was worth managing instead of filling in. She visited both properties that fall, brought Sylvia Kestrel out for water testing on one of them, and ended up helping a young couple named the Ashfords convert a 2-acre pond on the valley's northern edge into a small second operation using stock and starts from her own pond, asking nothing in return beyond the same kind of forward favor nobody had ever offered her, and she'd had to build entirely from scratch herself. The Ashfords' pond, smaller and shallower than Della's, took nearly 2 seasons to find its balance the way Kestrel had predicted it eventually would, and more than once that first year the young couple called Della in something close to panic over a die-off or a cloudy week, only to be talked back from the edge of giving up by someone who'd been through exactly that uncertainty herself a few years earlier. Regional farm press coverage of Holt County over the following 2 years shifted in a way that had little to do with traditional dairy production and everything to do with a small but growing reputation for unconventional, high-value pond aquaculture, with 2 separate trade publications running features on Della's operation specifically, language that, while never naming Cyrus Dunmore directly, made clear which assumptions about value in that valley had just been publicly overturned. Cyrus did not lose his dairy operation, his feed co-op, or his seat on the conservation board over any of it, and Dunmore Dairy remained, by herd size and case production, the largest agricultural operation in Holt County for years afterward. What he lost, more gradually and more permanently, was the assumption, held by nearly everyone in the valley for 3 decades, including Cyrus himself, that his judgment about what counted as worthless ground or worthless water was simply correct by default. Otis Greer, who had spent the first 2 years of the project half convinced he was watching a stubborn woman waste good money on dead water, stayed on at Voss Farm years past the age most hired hands in the valley had retired, and told anyone who asked that he'd rather manage 3 acres of difficult water than 60 acres of anything easy. A line he repeated often enough around the county that it eventually became something close to a standing joke at his own expense, one he seemed to thoroughly enjoy telling on himself. He took to giving informal tours of the pond to curious visitors on weekends, walking them along the bank, pointing out the aerators and the watercress beds with the proprietary pride of a man who had once doubted every bit of it and now couldn't quite stop talking about how wrong he'd been. Marguerite Boyle, whose own small distribution business had grown alongside the pond's reputation over those same years, eventually proposed a longer formal partnership rather than a simple seasonal contract, giving Della a direct stake in how her own crayfish and watercress were marketed for the first time instead of selling the harvest outright and watching someone else's restaurant menu carry all the credit for it. Cyrus Dunmore came down to the Voss place himself for the first time in over a year on a clear afternoon that fall, parking at the same gate where he'd once told Della, with a straight face, that he was doing her a kindness by offering to take dead water off her hands. He asked her, with considerably less of his old certainty in his voice, whether she'd be willing to let Sylvia Kestrel take a look at too low, perpetually wet acres on the edge of his own land that he'd spent 30 years treating as nothing but a drainage nuisance. Della told him she would, on the same terms she'd already offered the Ashfords and anyone else who'd asked since the hearing, and didn't make him stand at the fence apologizing for a decade of offers and complaints he probably still didn't fully understand the irony of. She didn't need to. The crayfish traps coming up heavy, season after season, had already said everything that needed saying. By the following spring, Sylvia Kestrel's water samples from those 2 low acres on Dunmore land had come back showing nearly the same nutrient richness as the Voss Pond once carried, and Cyrus, working alongside Della's notes for the first time instead of against them, began the same slow process of turning a piece of ground he'd spent 30 years treating as a nuisance into something he could finally call productive. The lesson Holt County eventually took from the whole affair, repeated at the feed co-op counter and the diner booth for years afterward in place of the old jokes about the Voss place smelling bad come July, was simpler than the water chemistry that actually explained it. The label a community puts on something, dead, worthless, a liability, often says far more about who never bothered to look closely than it does about the thing itself. Cyrus Dunmore had filed a complaint in 1978 meant to document a problem and protect himself from a question nobody had even asked yet, and assumed, for 9 years, that the word he'd used to describe that water settled the matter permanently, never once considering that the very same data, read by someone willing to ask a different question, might tell an entirely different story. Della Voss spent 4 quiet years writing down what she actually saw at the edge of that water instead of repeating what everyone around her had always said about it. And by the time anyone with real standing in the county was finally forced to read her notebook alongside the science, the pond that had been the butt of a decade of jokes had become the most productive 3 acres on the entire farm. And the answer she'd found was sitting in exactly the same water everyone else had been driving past and holding their noses at the whole time. Drive past the Voss place along the county road today, and that back corner no longer looks like anything anyone would call dead water. The aerators still hum quietly at the center of the pond. The watercress still grows thick and dark green along the margins exactly as it did the first season it took, and the gate where Cyrus Dunmore once offered to take a liability off her hands now has nothing more than a small hand-lettered sign giving the farm's name. No boast, no claim. Nothing the water itself hadn't already proven on its own terms years before anyone bothered to ask it the right question. 3 acres that the whole county had agreed for over a decade weren't worth the trouble of keeping now produce, by the season, more value per acre than the rest of the 60-acre farm combined. A gap that exists for exactly the same reason that pond sat ignored for 11 years in the first place. Almost nobody thought to ask whether the very thing making the water look sick might also be the thing that made it valuable. Cyrus Dunmore still runs the largest dairy operation in Holt County and still chairs the Conservation Board. None of that changed. What changed, quietly and permanently, was that nobody in the valley assumes anymore that the man with the biggest herd and the loudest opinion automatically knows which ground, or which water, is worth keeping. It's worth sitting with how easily the whole thing could have gone the other way. If Della had taken Cyrus's offer in 1981 the way most people in her position would have, there would be nothing on that back corner today but 6 more acres of cleared, ordinary ground indistinguishable from everything around it. If Otis hadn't happened to mention the bullfrogs out loud on a tailgate one evening, the pattern Della eventually wrote down might never have been noticed at all. And if Cyrus hadn't pulled his own 9-year-old complaint out of a county file to fight a petition he was certain he'd win, nobody would have ever laid his own decade-old data next to the proof of exactly what it had been documenting the whole time without anyone realizing it. Water like that exists, in some form, on farms and back corners all over, written off the moment it looks wrong instead of being asked what it's actually carrying, which is exactly why the answer is so often sitting in plain, smelly, overlooked sight, waiting for somebody patient enough to keep a notebook instead of believing the rumor. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go, because it genuinely helps these videos reach more people who'd appreciate them. Share it with somebody who's ever been told the thing right in front of them wasn't worth the trouble. They'll know exactly why you're sending it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one landing in your feed. And down in the comments, Tell us about a time something everyone else had written off turned out to be worth far more than anybody believed. We read every single one. The thing worth remembering, long after the specifics of any one pond or any one county fade, is how little it actually takes to start seeing what everyone else has stopped looking at. A notebook, a few quiet evenings at the water's edge, and the simple willingness to keep watching long after everybody else has already decided they know the answer.